Um, we made it to another week, so happy Friday to everyone, and I appreciate that everyone is willing to join us for another 2 hours of conversation on this very important topic, especially on a Friday afternoon. So, as evidenced by the last conversation that we had, 2 hours was not enough to cover all the topics that we had set out to do. And so our plan today would basically be to pick up where we left off at the last meeting. I believe everyone that's attending today was at the last meeting, but then to circle back and to address any kind of unstated or unaddressed issues that you might have thought about after the last stakeholder meeting on the first few themes that we covered: the inundation risk zone, the changes to the flood hazard area, and the changes to the rules to increase protections of our resources and whatnot. So we'll start off today with nature-based solutions because I believe that's where we left off, and we'll talk about that, renewable energy and process improvements, and then after we've had an opportunity to chat about those things, we'll circle back to the other issues, and you can raise things that you may have not thought of at the time or were afraid to bring up at the time, or after, if you're like me, 5 minutes after you get off the call, you thought, oh, why didn't I raise that issue? That would have been such a great question. So this is your chance. So I'm going to ask Lauren Zarillo if you could just give some kind of reminders of how we'll proceed, and then I'll start with the PowerPoint.
Hi, thanks, Vince. My name is Lauren Zarillo. I'm a regulatory officer at DEP. Just a quick to start off with, we are recording this, and we did begin recording it. I'm not going to go over Teams again because I know we already did that last time, but just a reminder to please keep yourself muted if you aren't speaking, because this is a very large group of people and the background noise can get loud. And if you're on the phone, the reminder is *6 to mute and unmute yourself. We are going to have somebody moderating hand raising again, just like last time, and the chat like last time. But this time we would ask that we would prefer if you'd raise your hands. I mean, chat box is still open. Certainly use it, but we will try to get to that at the end of the conversation. We're going to keep more of a verbal conversation going right now. And again, when you are called on, please state your name and your organization. That way we know who's talking. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. And again, for those who are just joined us after I began speaking, my name is Vince Mazzei. I'm Assistant Commissioner for Watershed and Land Management at DEP. It's my privilege to be able to have this conversation with you. This is obviously a very important topic. It has wide-reaching impacts, and it's our time to make some decisions. It's our time to make a stand and do what's right for not just today, but for tomorrow. And so that's the driving principles that we have focused on, is that people should be protected today and for tomorrow, and that the environment should be protected for today and tomorrow, because those are our stakeholders, are the people of New Jersey and the environmental resources that we protect. So with that, I'm going to just launch right into where we left off last time. We had gone through the first 5 themes, and I'm hopeful that you can see the PowerPoint presentation on your screens for nature-based solutions.
Yes, we can see it.
Good, thank you. As Lauren mentioned, this is a dialogue. This is not us. It's not DEP talking. It's DEP listening. And so I'll set up a few topics, and we'll go through the slides, and then I just invite you to have to share your thoughts and have a robust conversation on these issues. All right. So first, nature-based solutions. Now, in the flood hazard rules, and to a lesser extent, but somewhat in the wetlands rules, we have sort of a hierarchy set up that if stabilization is to occur along an eroded shoreline or in an area that is going to be developed, that we want to see vegetative solutions used first, right? There's a hierarchy. And so the thought here is to extend that concept across all of our regulations, to say that when stabilization is to occur, that we use things like living shorelines and other nature-based solutions rather than hard armoring as your first place and of design. And obviously there are a lot of environmental benefits associated with that. There's some challenges associated with that. So what the next couple slides do is it explains more specifically how we would amend our coastal rules to encourage nature-based solutions and make living shorelines easier and also the starting point for the discussion when you're coming in for a permit. So you've all seen these slides before, so I won't spend a lot of time going through them. I'll do a quick overview, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. So obviously our goal here is to encourage the use of nature-based solutions. And I think this is going to become even more relevant as, we'll circle back, but in our last conversation, we started speaking about the inundation risk zone that the department is intending to identify. So this is the area of land that is anticipated to be underwater permanently or twice a day, let's say, at least, by a certain date in the future, assuming certain models and methodologies. So the thought is that folks that have land within that inundation risk zone, and if that land is served by a roadway that would otherwise be reachable, but the land itself is below that inundation risk zone elevation, I can see that people are going to want to raise up properties in these developable areas. And so what does that mean for the edge, right? We don't want to see seawalls all over the place along our coastline. So I think it's going to become much more relevant as time goes on. This means by which we would stabilize eroded areas and facilitate beneficial reuse of dredging material and so on. So some basic changes to the rules there, some requirements of construction completion. One of the things that I think we do real well at DEP is we give a robust upfront review to our applications, and we make sure that the plans meet the rules, and we have rules that are very prescriptive and strict in some manners, but then we release the permit, and sometimes we don't have the opportunity to know whether it was completed, how it was completed, whether it's working. So these are things that will be an important component of this. So any thoughts so far on anything I've said?
Vince, Tim Dillingham has a comment in the chat. I don't know if he'd like to speak instead, but.
Sure.
Hey, Tim.
Okay. Good morning, Vince. Good morning. Thank you. First off, we're really happy to hear the department talking about strengthening the use of nature-based systems. The hardening of the edges is a tremendous impact on the estuaries, in particular the bays, and the loss of habitat there. I guess my broad question is, when you start to look at where you have to make decisions about fill and elevations, obviously we really hate the idea of filling waters and it's sort of really going to extreme lengths to make properties developable. So my question was, are you going to use the CAFRA planning areas to guide some of that decision making, right, where you've already made high-level policy decisions about where growth is more intensively appropriate and where it's not?
That's a good question. So what would that look like?
Well, you have a range. You have a range of planning areas, right, from planning area 1 to planning area 5, and there's right now the sort of key regulatory instruments in those planning areas are the impervious cover limits, the exclusion or protection, if you want to look at it from my perspective, of environmentally sensitive resources. Limitations on infrastructure extensions, right? The idea that came out of the state plan and was then integrated into CAFRA was we should be guiding growth so it's not spread out across the landscape. In the adaptation or climate response framework, we're going to have to make decisions about where we invest and where we don't invest, right? Because I don't think you want to be having the state allow or facilitate heavy infrastructure investment in places that are going to be at high risk because of inundation or storm conditions. But conversely, there are going to be places that we're going to want to defend, for lack of a better term, and where harder responses might be appropriate. But again, the planning areas are fairly well laid out, reflective of the landscape there and some growth potential. And so that gives you a framework to say where we are going to allow infrastructure in particular, or intensive development, or as you're talking about now, maybe fill and elevation, and areas that we aren't. So planning area 5, where there's environmentally sensitive resources, and those are not places that the department should be making decisions to intensify growth. And so this is a little off the the direct subject of nature-based approaches, but that kind of calls for I mean, at one level, it provides predictability to your decision making, right? So you can't come in and build a mini city in an area that's inside this new critical inundation zone in a planning area 5. But we may be looking at hardening being more appropriate in the more urbanized parts of the state, and where we've decided that investments are going to be protected as we get these new stressors. So
right. No, those are fantastic points, and I think this is exactly the kind of conversation we need to have. And just as a side note, I'll cycle back to this. The slides disappeared, I noticed, and we were looking at the flood hazard rules. Somebody must have done something. It wasn't me. So do you see the slides again at this point?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, Tim, that's the crux of the matter, is that we want to reach that balance where we're promoting, we're encouraging development and redevelopment in the areas that can support it, and that we're protecting the areas that can and shouldn't, right? And so as we navigate this and we encourage the use of nature-based solutions, we should be mindful of what that does to the developmental potential for that area, right? And it should be in accordance with our CAFR findings.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Vince,
Thanks, Vince.
Thank you, Tim. Vince, we have Walter Douglas. His hands up.
Good morning, Walter.
Morning, Vince. Yeah, Scott Douglas. Walter
Scott.
Is only what the IRS and the state know me as, but most people know me as Scott. I'm the dredging program manager for the Office of Maritime Resources at New Jersey DOT. And the only thing that I don't disagree with what Tim is saying about development in the coastal zone. However, I would like to carve out an exception for restoration projects. Most of the projects that we've been using dredge material on beneficially to do marsh platform enhancement and shoreline stabilization, they're all restoration. They're not for development. So, but we go through the same process when we get our permits. I just don't want to get hung up in new rules that are really designed to discourage, hardening of shorelines and development in sensitive areas. But we still want to be able to use dredge material beneficially to improve the habitat. We see that as a major. It's a major initiative for DOT in order to be to work with the resource agencies to beneficially use dredge material and keep it in the system. If we do things that hamstring that or make it really expensive or even impossible, like saying that you can't ever use a hardened edge in order to do these projects, that would be a real impediment to progress, in my opinion.
Well said. I agree with you that we historically our regulations were mostly focused on how to manage development, right, and how the development impacts the environment around it, and we've made some steps and want to continue to make steps, as evidenced by this rulemaking effort that we're undertaking, to encourage and facilitate those projects that you spoke to, right? The environmentally beneficial projects that are not driven necessarily by a development need, but driven by restoration and meeting the same goals that we set out for this rulemaking. So those are good points. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Vince, we have Virginia Reddick.
Good morning.
Hey, Vince, this is Virginia Reddick. I'm the refuge manager at Edmund B. Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge. And since Scott spoke up, I'll just build on to what he was sharing, because we've been working together on a couple of habitat restoration projects. And I'm actually thinking back to when there was no living shoreline, permit possibility. So now we're actually modifying it based on what we've learned. And I think that's super, super great,
Good.
so to say. But I want to make sure, so I'm not worried about what's in here that doesn't allow us to do things. I want to make sure that the things that we're looking to do in the future are captured in a way that anyone coming down behind us doesn't have the ability to sort of say, well, we'll make this work under these rules. I want to keep refining so that we can do these restoration projects. So I just wanted to share that some of the things that we've actually just done and will continue to seek to do is, and I know this as an example shows about placing beneficial material on the marsh platform. So that's kind of covered, or will be, I guess, in the new rule, which is very important to us. But we also are pursuing, open water placement of material. So kind of onto what Scott was saying, we want to place, where appropriate, say like on a beach area, more sand to make the marsh behind it more resilient. And so we want to make sure that that's not restricted or prohibited. We go through all the other appropriate, boxes to check on timing, year restrictions and all that good stuff. And then we're also seriously pursuing, I'm chairing Barnegat Bay Islands working group, and we are going to be pursuing building onto and potentially constructing islands. And so I want to make sure that these regulations coming down the line here will actually support that, again, checking all the appropriate boxes, and so that there's nothing that hinders us from being able to do that moving forward.
Great points. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. And Ben Stoneman, MRT, had a comment in the chat that says marine nodes, even in planning area 5, need to have the ability for exceptions as well. Ben, if you'd like to come off mute and expand on that, feel free, or if you're good, we can move on. Okay,
right.
sorry, we have another hand up. Patricia Delaware.
Hi, Vince. This is Patty Durr with the Nature Conservancy here in New Jersey. I'm the director of our coastal and marine program, and I just want to add on to what Virginia and Scott said. I totally agree, and Tim as well, that nature-based solutions are going to be a vital part of the toolbox as we deal with climate change moving into the future. And I know I'm pretty much preaching to the choir in that regard, which I very much appreciate. We love seeing these kinds of rules and steps being taken to make sure that we have as many tools in the toolbox as possible. And to Virginia and Scott's point, we need to just ensure that innovation is possible into the future, because the ecosystem is going to continue to change. We as a group are going to have to figure out and continue to evolve and innovate as we go. And so I love seeing some of the things that are in here that I think are going to allow for that. We also have to have a discussion at some point around what are the marshes that we really need to focus on in terms of saving, because we're not going to be able to save them all. We're going to lose a good chunk of them over the next several decades. And so I think that sort of speaks to Tim's point about where do we want to really focus these types of activities. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Patty. Yeah, I agree with you that we need to be strategic about this, right? And one thing that I like what you said about this being a tool in the toolbox for folks to use, and I very much view that what we're trying to accomplish in this rulemaking is that we would provide prospective applicants with those tools, right? Whether it's in nature-based solutions, or whether it's a resiliency issue, or any other things that we're covering, because we want folks to have the ability to make good decisions that will meet the goals of their needs, right? So, and to that end, one thing that is, and this is sort of an open invitation to the folks on the call that have worked with nature-based solutions like this before, we love to hear your success stories, and we love to hear your challenges, because we spend a lot of time trying to craft rules that hit the mark, and sometimes we hit it dead on, and sometimes we miss it a bit, and sometimes the only way that we're going to know whether what we're proposing works or doesn't work is to hear those stories and say, you know, this type of thing generally works really well, and here's an example of it, and this type of thing sounds good, but it has these challenges because of long-term maintenance or whatnot. So I would just invite any of the folks that have success stories, or you know, we can learn just as much from our setbacks. I won't say failures, but our setbacks as our successes. So open invitation.
Vince, we have Mark Gallagher with his hand up.
Hey, Mark.
Hey, Vince. I think we've made a lot of headway on just contemplating these types of projects. Because I mean, think about it, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, placing dredge material in a marsh would have been received the no almost immediately. So I understand, you know, nature-based solutions and their goals, but one of the conflicts that I would anticipate, and I've seen, is conversion of habitat. So even placing dredge material in a marsh where it might be some low marsh sections now, and we're essentially raising the elevation, the high marsh, how is the state going to facilitate, or at least create an opportunity to understand that not all those conversions are negative?
Because it's a balancing act, is what you're saying. Is that in trying to reach that? Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. Poplar Island required a coalition, essentially, of resource agencies and NGOs and academia to make the case that the island would have greater ecological uplift than preserving the open water at that spot. Mm-hmm. Now, it probably won't work in every location, but I'm hopeful the department can come up with a mechanism to be able to make those arguments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of our guiding principles is balancing the different resources that we have, and that's one of the things that you can see throughout. You know, like in our next topic, talking about renewable energy, is trying to balance the protection of the resources and what we're trying to facilitate with the benefits that were received. So yeah, that's definitely part of the conversation that we have to have, and you know, we have a lot of expertise within the department that can help guide that conversation as well.
Jennifer Kofi.
Hey, Jen.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to reinforce the comment about the materials in wetlands. The Partnership for Delaware Estuary, I'm with NJPACT, as you know. I'm the executive director of the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. But one of our partner organizations, Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, through a very large initiative we've been working on called the Delaware River Watershed Initiative, has really interesting responses from wetlands and soil deposition. And so my understanding, without trying to speak about their research in detail, is that the wetlands and marshes that are already suffering from the impacts of sea level rise, it's really challenging to try to save those, and we don't have good methodology to do that yet. But if you are able to add several inches a year of soil deposition to the wetlands and the marshes that are just behind those that are drowning, you can really bolster their resiliency to sea level rise and provide protection for inland structures and habitats. So I think, yes, seeing some, if you will, altruistic uses for soil deposition is something that we're certainly interested in. But looking at soil deposition or raised property that might allow additional development is not really a direction that makes us feel warm and fuzzy.
Mm-hmm. Understood. I hear you. I should underscore too. Thanks, Jen. I should underscore that, you know, we are working collaboratively with other agencies and the science that's out there. So both internally and outside the department. So, you know, my invitation stands to provide us with data, the success stories, with the setbacks, and And we endeavor to craft a rule that will facilitate the right things, and hopefully save some wetlands in the process.
Okay, Tim Dillingham.
Thanks. Just a little clarification on my earlier comments about using the CAT for planning areas. I was responding to what I thought Vince was raising about development itself. But on the restoration stuff, I want to say again, yes, the use of sediment, the marsh restoration work is all really important, and it's great to see the department making it easier to happen. I want to commend and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the new division, but what I would call the land use, the LERP staff. As many of you know, the Littoral Society is very involved in habitat restoration along the Delaware Bay. And the staff really worked with us to construct a sort of regional permit that would allow the work to happen without tremendous need to come back in for every element of the project, right? I mean, we all know coastal systems in particular are dynamic, they change. The work that we're trying to do to restore the beaches, the marshes down there to help recover red knot and horseshoe crabs happens out over a long amount of time. So the department really was wonderful in collaboration about constructing a regulatory instrument that met your obligations, met the compliance with the law, but also provided us as practitioners enough flexibility to be able to do this project over time and to be responsive to changes that might happen. And I think we'll find, when we decide where those system-wide approaches, right, whether it's island building in Barnegat or marsh restoration up in the Hackensack, we're going to want to work regionally, right? And you're going to want to have those projects be considered and evaluated as comprehensively as possible. And you want the regulatory mechanisms to reflect that and to facilitate it. So this idea of a regional multi, timeline permit, I think has a lot of value, and you might want to consider how that fits into this.
Thank you, Tim. Those are good points. Appreciate that. So, for the interest of time and just to make sure that we get to an opportunity to circle back to the issues that we not only missed last time but also want to revisit, I'm going to move on to the next topic of renewable energy. But is there any last statements before we move on to that?
Vince, just some comments in the chat supporting incorporating the state master plan areas that were developed through extensive coordination between DEP, DCA, local governments, and a comment about Tim's comments. TNC would be supportive of the use of more regional permits for restoration.
Good. Thank you. Thanks, Lauren. All right. So again, the invitation is always open. If you have additional thoughts, you know how to access us and share them electronically. You can pick up the phone. You can have a conversation with us. So the next topic, renewable energy and green building design. So now what I did was there are 2 slides related to offshore wind from the presentation that we circulated. But just this morning, I added 3 more slides that kind of help focus the conversation to more specifically what we're intending to do, and to get your feedback on that. So, as we mentioned before, as in everything, we're trying to strike a balance between maintaining our resources, in this case habitat, while encouraging renewable energy such as offshore wind. And so some of the places that we've been focusing in this conversation and in this moving forward to adopt standards that can adapt to the changing climate and also can facilitate these beneficial use, is to address specific issues related to it, right? So the installation of electric transmission cables, how that interacts with the shellfish habitat rule and the coastal rules. What does the submerged cable rule say with relation to electric cables and so on? And so the 2 slides that we had before were a little more general, right? Speaking of, we need to modify our marine fish and fisheries rule to include provisions that are appropriate or to add public notice requirements. But I'm going to go a little bit more specific And these were some thoughts that we shared with industry professionals earlier this week about those particular issues of electric transmission cables, the shellfish habitat, and so on. So first, our goal with electric transmission cables is to protect the habitat and environmentally sensitive areas by ensuring that electric transmission cables associated with renewable energy projects or their components avoid or minimize potential adverse impacts of these resources. So that's our guiding principle here. And so our conceptual pre-decisional proposal, and I couch it that way to say we haven't filed a rulemaking yet, right? We're still in the process of developing this, and that's why these conversations are so important. Our thought, based on what the science that we've seen and the feedback we've gotten, is to require a burial depth of 2 meters, but then to have an opportunity for an assessment study if a different depth is necessary. And of course, then also add public notice requirements for electric transmission cable installation so that interested parties can weigh in. So any thoughts on this particular issue?
Ron has his hand up.
Yeah,
morning,
hey,
Ron.
Vince. Ron Rapp from Subcom. We're not involved, our company's not involved in power cables per se, but we've been laying all the telecommunication cables off New Jersey and around the world for many decades. Many of you met many of you on the call, and we've been involved in some of the the regional planning boards as well. I think we spoke about this, or we exchanged emails. I think in general, I think that's a reasonable requirement, and that is 2 meters, 1.5 to 2 meters is typically what we use in burying telecom cables. They're smaller than the power cables and less electrical impacts. But there will be maybe some places along the New Jersey continental shelf where the seabed is hard and may not be able to get to 2 meters, which actually is a good thing too, because that means fishing gear and other gear can't penetrate as deeply there either. So this is all done through a burial assessment survey, burial feasibility study, looking at risk and possible burial depth along the way. So I think your sentence there about unless determined through a burial risk assessment that a different depth is necessary, I think should cover that. But yeah, I think in general that's a reasonable requirement. From I'm speaking from a telecom perspective. So your renewable companies may want to weigh in as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just want to point out too, to kind of echo what you said, that and you'll see this throughout this rulemaking, and this is something that we generally try to do in our rules, is to set a standard that's protective, and then have an opportunity for a deviation from that in based on an assessment or analysis of some kind, right? So we see that play out in many different ways throughout the rules, and so this is very much similar. That we feel comfortable with 2 meters, but we recognize that the substrate varies, and that the needs at that location might dictate a different depth. So thanks for those comments.
Yeah. One other thing I was going to make on some of the other discussion that Tim was having, you were all having about the beach. I think most of the cables, if not all in New Jersey, the telecom cables are brought under the beach and dunes through a horizontal directional drill. So they're put in with minimal disturbance of the beach and dune. But it does require a rig, a drilling rig behind the dune, in some parking lot there. And I think that would be, in New Jersey at least, the recommended way to go there. So it's, but it still requires a permit, but just it's a much less invasive way to land a telecom cable, and the power industry may be considering similar techniques as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Mark Hellman had his hand up.
Good morning, Mark.
Yeah. Hey, Vince, how you doing?
Good.
The only thing I was going to say is that I just saw it in the Federal Register I think on Wednesday, the Corps has issued some new nationwide permits, and some of them deal with offshore energy projects, and specifically, I think transmission cables are noted in there. So you may want to review those new nationwides to see if they're in accordance or conjunction with any rulemaking that you're proposing.
Yes, thank you. We are aware of those, and you're right. That's important. That's an important point to make. So thanks, Mark.
Ray Nichols.
Ray, good morning. Ray, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Now can you hear me?
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning. Congratulations upon your promotion to Assistant Commissioner.
Thank you.
As a former colleague, I always considered you one of the sharpest knives in the drawer within DEP, and I'm glad to see you in your current position.
Thank you.
A couple of comments about burying cables, since that's what we're on right now, is that it would be important that the trenches are refilled after the cable is installed. Many years ago, I was called to the coastal area about a offshore sewer line that had not been refilled and created an open trench in an area that was relatively shallow. But with today's technology, it would be relatively simple to get a video survey post-construction that would show that the trench is refilled.
Wow, that's an interesting point. Yeah.
So I think that that ought to be built into your permitting process. General comment along the same line for everything is that the trust but verify. There have been too many cases in historical past where the department trusted developers to do what the permit said, but it didn't happen. I'm not saying all developers are like that. I'm saying it's not uncommon. And therefore, I think built into the rules should be ways that facilitate post-construction inspections and periodic inspections if necessary. I'm thinking about the rules in the air quality program that permits are relatively expensive compared to land use, simply so that they can have inspectors in the field. And I've seen land use lose inspectors and not have them replaced. So I'll stop with those two comments, other than my earlier comment that many of the younger people today may not be aware of those plans that were shelved many years ago called the State Master Plan. And Tim, who mentioned that they're relevant today and should be incorporated into the rules and re-examined. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Thank you for weighing in on that. It's always good to hear from you.
Kim McKenna.
Good morning, Kim.
Hello, I'm Kim McKenna, and I'm the Associate Director of the Stockton University Coastal Research Center. And I just wanted to point out that we've been monitoring shoreline changes of the New Jersey ocean coast for about 35 years now. So we have a very good data set of long-term changes at the coast. And I wanted to just make sure that your rule includes, if you have these cables coming onto the beach, that you look at long-term shoreline erosion. And so siting is very important. You may get more than 2 meters of erosion, especially in the near shore. So, you know, it's something to keep in mind when you give some flexibility. I like the burial risk assessment studies. I think that's important. That could be included, or the shoreline change information could be included in that. But I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. That's helpful. Yeah, I guess there are a few ways to approach it, right? We could say 2 meters unless the applicant makes a demonstration, but then there also could be an opportunity for the department to weigh in if we recognize that the area is subject to erosion or due to the currents and other issues there that a deeper burial depth is warranted, then maybe there's an opportunity in the rules to address that.
Hey Vince, can I just jump in here if you don't mind?
Yes, thank you, Sean.
Yeah, so I think some of what these last couple of comments are getting to are highlighting that, and what we will be doing is including post-construction, post-installation monitoring requirements that would be intended to include inspections and other things that would get at some of these issues to make sure that, once that burial risk assessment is done, once we've determined that it is of the appropriate depth, that those cables remain and that the applicant remains diligent in ensuring that the protection that comes with that burial depth is maintained throughout the life of those cables. So I think that's part of what we would be looking at. I think, you're right to say that, some of what, that shoreline erosion would be included in the risk assessment, which would inform that decision. But post decision, we will have requirements to make sure that those things don't change.
Thanks, Sean.
Okay, Tim Dillingham.
Hey, Tim.
Hey, thanks. So to sort of bring it up a little out of the burial question, the idea of sort of avoidance in the offshore wind strategic planning process. There was a decision by the department, I think, to try to prioritize the avoidance of primary fishing areas and other sensitive resources. So I don't know how that expresses itself here in this rule. There are areas that are of ecological and fishing importance that are protected by regulatory designation. There are obviously other habitats under the marine fisheries rule that would be important in places to avoid. So Vince, could you speak a little bit to how you guide that avoidance issue across the, sort of the breadth of the coastline where we're likely to see renewable energy projects taking place?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, what I'll do is I'll come back to the shellfish habitat slide because the next slide deals directly with marine fish and fisheries. So our objective is similar, right? As we've previously stated. So the thinking is that these projects are conditionally acceptable if the potential adverse impacts are avoided or minimized, right, to the maximum extent. And so that takes into account everything about the installation of it, the operation of the offshore wind, and the impact to marine fish and fisheries. Sean, would you like to speak a little more pointed to Tim's comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim, your comments are well put. I mean, I think as Vince would tell you, a large portion of our rules are focused on avoidance, minimization, and mitigation, right? So, as part of what we're talking about with the marine fish and fisheries, or we're talking about the shellfish areas, is avoidance being primary, and looking at methods, whether they're HDD or whether it's just going around those areas, we would intend to enforce that avoidance component accordingly, and only where, excuse me, it is really necessary to go across these particularly sensitive areas, will we then engage in a minimization conversation, which Tim would to include something we talked about a couple months ago, a conversation about co-location and assessment of how these cables can be hopefully clustered together as it is technically feasible to do, to minimize, again, those crossings. And then only when we get to that point where we have explored avoidance, minimize those impacts as much as possible, then we get into mitigation. And that's where we start to talk about, when you get into the shellfish rules specific to oyster habitat and clam habitat, how exactly we would go about enforcing those mitigation requirements.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
Peter Himchek.
Peter, good morning.
Yes, thank you. I'm representing La Monica Fine Foods, and it's a New Jersey-based seafood company that harvests and processes surf clams. Now, I see from the PowerPoint presentation slides 46 and 47 in particular, that there will be modifications to CZM rules to address current dredging policies that were all outlined back in September of 23, September 23rd, 2020. And I want to shift the focus to not just the shellfish resources and habitats within state waters. Certainly, the CZM rules need to address, any new dredging in shellfish habitat, which is generally currently prohibited. However, what's lost in this is a bigger picture of a resource in the EEZ, and there is a lease area that encompasses the most valuable surf clam habitat in the Mid-Atlantic region. I mean, it completely envelops it. So when you're talking about transmission lines in dredging a new shellfish habitat, if the wind farm array proceeds in this lease area, which is the most important along the East Coast for surf clams, the transmission lines within the grid itself, they're going to carve up that entire primary habitat for shellfish. And where this comes into play is that there needs to be a federal consistency determination on whether that action that is 15 to 20 miles offshore is consistent with your CZM rules, which are now being amended. And I fear that this issue is being lost. And I just keep bringing it up at these webinars and Zoom meetings that the surf clam industry is so in so much jeopardy. And when I see you amending the CZM rules that I've read for energy siting wind farms, this can be devastating to a resource that is not in state waters, but the state has the ability to protect this particular resource, because it would, to do otherwise would not be consistent with a federal consistency determination. So can somebody comment on that part of the development of renewable energy? We are certainly not opposed to the development of offshore wind energy, but there was absolutely no thinking in the establishment of this lease area. And it continues to be discussed, and plans are being made for a full rollout of, oh God, I don't know how many wind turbines. And I think this type of an impact is being lost.
Yeah, so you raise a number of really great points. I'm going to start out by addressing a couple of things, and then I'd like to invite some of my staff that are on the call that are dealing with this more specifically to kind of address some of the finer points of what you said. But this kind of does speak to our overall goal, which is to balance, is to find balance. So can we find a way to promote and encourage and facilitate offshore wind in a way that doesn't jeopardize those areas that you spoke of, right? So that is exactly what we're hoping to accomplish here. And to my staff, do you have any specific thoughts, or to the Shellfish folks that are on the call?
Ben, let me just take a shot what folks are thinking. Maybe if we go to the next slide. And I think we should touch on this. And I think that I think we've reached the conclusion that we need to continue to have deeper conversations with you, Peter, and some of your colleagues on these issues. I think we're going to kind of need to continue part of what we talked about on Wednesday night about how we really get to the bottom of the concerns. I mean, we are, as part of, the marine fish and fisheries rule, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make the rules clearer and more robust in terms of what they require for mitigation and avoidance and these things. And I think that what we are trying to do here, and if we are not hitting the mark, I think we need to have more of an offline conversation with a smaller group, just in consideration of time, and we'll have that very soon if necessary. But what we're trying to do with the marine fish and fisheries rule is to make clear what those mitigation requirements are, to make clear that we would apply those same conditions, the avoid, minimize, and mitigate conditions that we would apply to the shellfish habitat where we're talking about is more inshore. And I think that, we're not going to get into project specifics here, but as part of that federal consistency process, that's what we would be looking to enforce in those areas. And that's where we would be working with our watershed land management staff, as well as staff from the marine fisheries group, to make sure that we're addressing those impacts to the best of our ability. And I think that then, steps into that broader conversation that we had on Wednesday that gets into kind of a more multifaceted approach about how we get to this. With the solicitation and other things that we're not going to touch on here, but we're listening. If we're not hitting the mark exactly how we need to, let's continue to talk. But I think it might just be better and more productive if we talk a little bit more directly.
Yeah, because I mean mitigation and monitoring as an attempt to offset new dredging. If La Monica Fine Foods is taking 70% of their annual harvest out of a particular area, I don't know how much monitoring mitigation can make up for that loss. And there are other companies that are in this area too. And the issue of the wind arrays creating exclusion zones, we've been hammering at this for a couple of years. The closeness of the wind turbines and denying safe access to a fishery. It also runs counter to current CZM rules that promote commercial fisheries as a vital link to the Jersey Shore. So we are frustrated on a number of points, and the amendment of the current CZM rules, we will be watching them closely to see exactly what they are revised to, and the language that comes out of it. And that's about all I can say at this point. We're frustrated.
Yeah, no, we need to talk more. I mean, we're touching on more project specific issues than kind of rulemaking specific issues.
Sure.
But I want to assure you that, when we talk about what we're doing in the fish and fisheries rule, what our intent here is to provide additional protections to make clear what our expectations are when it comes to the enforcement of those provisions. It's really, it's more that than anything else, recognizing that we need to be sure and clear we are protecting the resources that you're speaking of. But let's talk further.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So
Barney,
any more thoughts?
Sorry,
go ahead,
Barney
Barney.
Hollinger has been very patient. He has his hand up.
Good morning.
Yes, thank you. I'm the chairman of the Delaware Bay Shellfish Council. I was on the call on Wednesday night. And I listened about the mitigation that we're going to do if we go across shellfish beds. One question I asked, I don't really think I got a real good answer, so I'm going to ask it again. Once this area is disturbed, and I'm not sure how wide an area it is when they lay these cables, but I was told that it pretty much liquefies the bottom, so we really lose the stability of the bottom especially where oysters are. So once it's mitigated and brought back, it's still going to be 2, 3, 4 years before that piece of bottom is now able to be dredged and the industry gets to take be able to work that place again. So I guess my question is, how are we going to reimburse the industry for the loss of the oysters that we normally would have been dredging on that.
I've lost the last piece of what you said. I apologize. My computer blinked out for a second.
It's okay. The question is once the mitigation's all done,
Mm-hmm.
and now it takes 2, 3, 4 years before we'll get oysters back on that area again, which is a loss to the industry. So how will the industry be reimbursed for the loss of product that we normally would have been able to take if this was not, if the cabling was not done?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this speaks to Sean. That's a very good point you're raising, and I think this speaks to Sean's point that we need to have more targeted discussions about this so that we can explore all these options. Sean, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think you're right on, Vince. I think we need to talk more about the specifics of how we would apply the mitigation, how if we can address that. I mean, I think as we shared on Wednesday, I mean, well, we understand the connection. We absolutely understand the connection between the industry and the folks who rely on these, and that is something that we consider as part of mitigation and part of our analysis. But our focus and what we're charged with protecting ultimately is that resource. So I think we have to make our mitigation assessments in connection with bringing back the lost use, and whether that includes specific compensation to the industry. I don't know if I can speak to that right now.
All right, thank you. Well, any more thoughts on offshore wind before we have a conversation about solar, and then talk about our process improvements?
Jeff Kalin has his hand up. We should hear from Jeff.
Oh, Jeff, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Vince and Sean. I don't want to take up a lot of time. I really appreciate what you've been saying after the last couple of comments, Sean. We had a good discussion on Wednesday, and we uncovered some of the issues like the monitoring of the cables, which you spoke to earlier when the gentleman raised a question. So I really appreciate what you've been saying. And to Mr. Dillingham's question, this issue has spilled over onto the Marine Fisheries Council's agenda. And as you might know, that we established a committee at the council last week to kind of sharpen the focus of wind energy for our constituency there, working with your bureau and also, of course, with the Marine Fisheries Administration. So that'll give us a platform, I think, to have some more in-depth comments in time here, because we really are setting the stage for the long haul. We're all going to be in this for the long haul. So I just wanted to let the people on the webinar today know that we do have a wind committee now with the Marine Fisheries Council, and that'll give us a chance to have our constituency understand some of these issues and the direction that we're headed in here better. And I just appreciate your support for more discussions like that, Vince and Sean. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate that, and we definitely look forward to continuing this in a form where we can get into the depth we need to really address these issues. And we're committed to doing that very soon, and we'll be in touch with the group to make sure we're having those conversations.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for those comments. So let's transition over to have a brief chat about solar. Again, it gets to our overall concept that we want to promote renewable energy, but we want to do it in a way that's responsible and doesn't take away one resource at the expense of or promote one resource at the expense of another, right? So, for example, if someone were to propose to cut down a forest of mature trees to put in solar panels, that's not a good trade, right? For a number of reasons, carbon sequestration and other things. So what are your thoughts, those that are on this call, on how we can achieve that balance? Is it a matter of saying that we should not have solar panels in a riparian zone or a transition area, or that they can happen in certain cases if the ground coverage is a certain type? And I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this.
Okay. Tom Gilbert.
Hi, Tom. Tom, I can't hear you if you're speaking.
Okay, sorry. How about now?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, thanks. I guess, a starting place is I would refer to what I thought was very good language in the GWRA 80 by 50 report, which talks about the need for clear guidance and rules to identify where renewable energy should and should not be sited, and states that the DEP should work with sister agencies to better define areas that are considered marginalized and could host renewable energy projects. For example, non-preserved farmland with poor soil conditions, as one example of marginal lands, and that we need to reconcile the goals of open space preservation and the value of land serving as natural carbon sinks with the need to obviously ramp up clean renewable energy. So I think that's a sound framework. There's a lot of detail there to be worked out, but I think it's really urgent because we're already seeing some massive utility scale solar developments proposed that do not fit that framework at all. Over 800 acres on prime farmland in Salem County, for example, bordered by 2 C1 streams. So the horse is kind of already out of the barn, and I think there's great urgency to, draw upon. There's a lot of good data out there already from the DEP solar siting analysis, from things like the conservation blueprint, to identify. I mean, I think we kind of need a sort of, red light, green light type of framework here, where we can identify those lands where it shouldn't go. Clearing forests, as you mentioned, Vince, keeping solar off our best farmland, our best soils, the lands that the state has identified for preservation, and identifying a set of marginal lands that could be appropriate, and also overlaying that with the needs of the solar developers and grid connectivity and those types of considerations as well. I do think there's an urgent need for kind of a coherent, comprehensive framework here that can hopefully provide some clarity for the developers in terms of where we want this development to go, and potentially even streamline approval in those kind of green light areas, and at the same time make it clear where we don't want this development to go.
Tom, that's a really good point. Sorry, I'm jumping in again, Vince, but I just want to, so, what we're talking about here is a small piece of a broader solar conversation that the state itself is having, including the department in consultation with its partners at BPU&A. And part of what we're looking at, I think, Tom, is exactly what you're talking about, just trying to get a handle on it, from a big picture perspective, how we deal with solar siting throughout the state. And Vince's rules are part of that, but not a very small part, but a small part of that. And I think we're going to be hopefully in a position to engage in the short term on that broader issue, Tom, and I'm looking forward to speaking specifically with you as we move forward there.
Glad to hear it, and happy to be a part of that conversation.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you both. Any additional thoughts on solar siting?
Yeah, we have Joe Cleary.
Good afternoon, Joe.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I will just say I'm with Maurice Piers in Wildwood, New Jersey, and if there's 300 people or 250 people on this call, 249 of you are much better at engineering and environmental. I am learning. But what I do have specific experience with is siting solar east of the boardwalk on our piers. And I just want to ask that as you develop regulations, probably with good intent, that you recognize that many times these kinds of things could just blow up good, honest projects on existing infrastructure. Our piers are east of the boardwalk. And I just have a little bit of a hesitancy as I hear this, and I've installed solar on several projects, and we've been very successful, and it's worked out very, very well. But I would be concerned that we were adding burdensome regulations in already developed areas as this overlaps all of the other kinds of things that you covered both in December and today. So as you do, I'm 100% in agreement with the idea that you don't clear cut forests to do this. We shouldn't have to. We're the most densely developed state in the nation, and we have plenty of areas there for solar. But I would ask that as you develop your rules, you do not intentionally or without realize that if you add burdens to trying to site solar on existing structures, because of rules, you're going to defeat the opportunities. And that's just my 2 cents. And I'll defer to the experts at engineering and environmental, but I'm basically a financial guy who's trying to do solar on existing infrastructure. Thank you.
No, those are great points, and I appreciate your perspective. We certainly are not intending to add burdens to redevelopment. What we're trying to do is find ways to incentivize the incorporation of solar in projects, whether they're new or reconstruction projects. For example, there's stormwater quality benefits to having a solar panels on top of your parking garage or over a parking lot, right? Because the solar panels the water hits that and it runs off and it doesn't interact with the pavement, and so then it doesn't need to be treated from a TSS percentage removal rate, for example. So finding ways to incentivize the placement of them, and also to make sure that when the placement is occurring outside developed areas, is it appropriate for that area? Is it offsetting one resource for the benefit of another? So that's not at our intention to make it more burdensome, but at the same time we want to try to find ways to incentivize it. So thank you.
Mike Pissarro.
Good afternoon, Mike.
Good afternoon, Vince. This is Mike Pissarro. I'm the policy director for the Watershed Institute. Being fully supportive of renewable energy, I think this concept of not taking one good at the expense of the other one is very important. And I'm hard pressed. I'm sure there might be exceptions to see a scenario where taking away a riparian zone or a transition area to put in renewable energy makes sense. Sort of to borrow from the Clean Water Act's requirements of avoid the harm, then minimize and then mitigate. Really big. Again, with the very little exception that there might be a fringe case, that really should just be a no-go zone. And as I think Mr. Cleary just mentioned, we are the most densely developed state in the country. There is plenty of rooftop in developed areas where it is possible to install most, if not all, of our solar energy. More disturbed areas where there is, lawns that can be avoided. And the other thing, even if you're sort of taking less than prime forest land to do solar, you've now created, additional edge forests, which has an impact and reduces the core forest, which may be healthier. So taking a look at those impacts as well. So even if you, as I said, you're sacrificing sort of that fringe part of the forest, which isn't really doing well, you've now removed more of that core. So, you're doing sort of an indirect impact, which could be a problem as well. So I think there should be, for the most part, a blanket, prohibition from damaging these types of resources. So I appreciate the opportunity.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you for those comments, Mike. I appreciate that. Did you guys lose the PowerPoint for a moment? Because I got kicked out of Teams. It's not good when you get kicked out of your own meeting. That's a bad sign. But hopefully you can see the slides again, everyone.
Yeah, we can see them, Vince.
All right, great. Thank you. Yeah, thank Mike for those comments. Any other last thoughts on solar before we go to the next topic?
We have 2 hands up, Vince. First, we have Barney Hollinger.
Yes, hi. I just want to say that I agree with Tom Gilbert. I'm a member of the State Board of Agriculture, and the board has taken a position that we want no solar on prime farmlands. And I know that I'm familiar with the one over in Salem at 800 acres, and there was just an article in the paper this morning that we're losing more farmlands in Millville to more. So that's the position of the state board is we don't want anything on prime farmlands. Thank you.
Okay, Claudia Roca.
Can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Claudia. Vince,
Okay,
you're on mute.
thanks. Hi, Vince. How are you? This is Claudia Rocca with PSE&G. PSE&G conducts the vast majority of our solar on building rooftops, brownfields, landfills, etc. And certainly supportive of not, damaging extensive, green fields for solar. But being careful, putting a blanket statement such as, no impacts to riparian zone vegetation, but certainly in the regulations, essentially it's, and anything that's pervious is considered riparian zone vegetation. So just being mindful of the caveats of that.
Thank you, Claudia. Can everyone hear me now? I don't know how I got muted.
Yes, we could hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for those thoughts, Claudia. Good to hear from you.
And just some thoughts from the comments from the chat, Vince. Coordinating with DCA to encourage installation of solar on existing buildings on this topic.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have been talking with DCA and with BPU to try to find ways that we can facilitate this and incentivize it. I'd love to see standards in place where where we're building certain building designs that it becomes just part of the normal operation of a construction activity. But there are a lot of things to balance here. So yeah, thank you.
And we have Keith Stample with his hand up.
Keith.
Hey, Vince. I might have missed it, but is it applicable to talk about floating solar arrays in this section, or is it just riparian zone implementation?
No, it's certainly appropriate to talk about it because really it comes down to the placement and siting of them. So we often, and maybe not everyone on the call is aware of this, but we often or have begun to see applications come to us for floating solar panels, right, in reservoirs and whatnot. So thoughts from the attendees on whether that's appropriate and what cases might it be appropriate, what kind of protections should be put in place, and so on.
Right. I thought that would be a good maybe topic to touch upon if anybody had any comments, because we have seen an influx of that recently.
Agreed. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Anyone with any thoughts on the topic?
Scott Douglas.
Hi, Scott.
Hey, Vince. Yeah, I just would be concerned about navigation hazards. The more things we put out there in the water, just need to make sure that they're not in our waterways or in areas that are typically typically vessels move through, especially in our port areas. But also in the back bay, got an awful lot of competition. So taking up large amounts of area, we just need to be very careful about where they're placed and make sure that there's some sort of a navigation assessment in the permitting process.
That's a good point. The only projects that I've seen personally so far have been on inland reservoirs, either human-made reservoirs or quarry pits that have filled in with water, that sort of thing. I haven't personally seen one in the bay. Has anyone seen a project like that come across their desk?
I have not.
Okay.
I don't think so. But
That's interesting, though. That's I suppose that's something to look out for. And when we do get to that point, then that is definitely consideration we need to make. So thank you.
Yep.
Any additional thoughts on this? All right. the door's never closed on you submitting comments, and we mean that sincerely, because we do review everything that's sent to us, because it is a hugely important part of the development of these rules. And I recognize too that people are comfortable with different means of communication. Not everyone is comfortable speaking up in a large group like this, or they need to think through what they want to say and email it. So there is that avenue, and I hope that you use it. All right, so the last topic before we circle back to the original ones with the time that we have left, I'll go through this relatively quickly because it's relatively straightforward what our plan is to do. So as you're aware, in our coastal rules and our flood hazard rules, we have what's called permits by rule, right? And permits by rule, honestly, if you look at any of our permitting programs, we basically have two types of permits. We have the permits that we promulgate as part of the rule, and then there's the individual permits that we issue for things that fall outside of those permits. So the promulgated permits are the permits by rule, permits by certification, general permits. So with general permits by certification or general permits, there's an interaction that happens with the department on one level or another, and there's tracking that can be done, and there's a file number that we can follow up on and whatnot. With permits by rule, those are relatively self-regulating. So if I want to build a pool in my backyard, there's a permit by rule for that, and the idea is that you would just undertake that activity without telling us, which has led to some obvious problems, because A, we can't track them if we don't know where they are. We don't know how many of them are being put into a watershed, and maybe it's not appropriate to have certain types of development in certain types of watersheds, or there should be a closer look. So for example, as part of our watershed-based approach to rulemaking that we endeavor to see as we move forward, there could be watersheds, let's say, that have impaired waters or TMDLs. And so do we want to have certain types of, maybe we have more stringent mitigation standards in those areas, or we have some types of permits have to be done on a site-by-site review under an individual permit. So the first step of this is to convert the permits by rule to what we're calling permits by registration. And what that means basically is that we would create this online system for free, where if someone were to undertake an activity, in order to be authorized under that activity, you'd have to go online and register some very basic information: your name, address, phone number, lot block, municipality, county, what activities you intend to undertake, the potential start date, and so on. And so then what'll happen is that'll automatically populate our database where we keep track of all the projects. You get a piece of paper that you can show to the town saying, I have registered for this. And that way we can begin to measure the impact that these small yet incremental projects are having on a watershed. So I think that there's only benefits to this. The only added step would be that someone has to go online into our portal and make those maybe 10 minutes worth of information to enter it in. And since it's free, we don't really see that being an obstacle. But does anyone have any thoughts about that and how that might work out?
Vince, we have Tony DiLavico with his hand up.
Hey, Tony.
Hi, Vince. I really raised my hand up right at the end of the previous discussion with the floating solar panels. Perhaps the department can further look into like floating wetlands, floating type treatment systems for, to remove nitrogen, phosphorus in lakes and in basins and whatnot. And maybe a combination of the two is something that could be encouraged if if you're trying to figure out what are these really practical, these floating solar panels. Well, maybe if you combine them with floating wetlands, are they really practical? You combine the two, and it might be such a benefit that's something that perhaps should be encouraged.
Yeah, that's a great point. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that.
Sure.
Sandy Blick.
Ms. Blick.
Sandy Blick, DOT. I do have a question with the permit by certification. You mentioned lot and block. Are you anticipating that this would also be applicable to long linear projects that cross multiple watersheds?
Yes, and so in a case like that, we would have an opportunity, instead of putting a lot block in, if all the work is within a right of way, because that could happen too with the utility line, that there would be a drop down box, and we would identify that it's a linear project, and then we'd have some other means of identifying where it is. So there might be an opportunity for the user to input a line of data that says, it's Route 70 from this point to that point, or it's a utility line from this town to that town, so that we can identify it.
Okay. Ray Cantor.
Ray, good afternoon.
Hey, Benny, how are you? Ray
Good.
Cantor, NJPACT. Intellectually, what you're proposing on permits by rules makes sense. In practice, I think there are a number of very real concerns. It's obviously not a big deal to just register and go online, in a free thing. But what you're dealing with in many of these instances are very small projects, often done by the way, thousands and thousands of these things I'm sure, are happening all the time. Many of these are being done by probably fairly unsophisticated people who are just, but by the way, things such as mowing your lawn, as you know, is a permit by rule. So I'm not sure how far you're going on this, but what you're very likely to have is a great amount of non-compliance just by the numbers. And now, what do? Are you now sending out NOVs? Are the benefits that you're looking to create by going after or tracking what should be fairly innocuous, no impact type of activities, is it worth the ultimate disruption and benefit you're looking to get? And again, I would think not. I think the department has made good decisions over the last couple of decades of trying to encourage people to do the minor activities, do what's under a permit by rule, so you don't have to come in for a GP. Do what's under a GP, so you don't have to come in for IP. Once you start making it harder, you're taking away, that incentive. And again, I think you're setting the department up for looking at thousands of permits that you really aren't going to be able to even look at, as a routine matter. And now you're going to have enforcement actions that you really don't want to get, into just for registration type of scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
The concept as well about, are we going to be seeing multiple types of permits that maybe shouldn't go into an impaired watershed? Well, as you probably know, every watershed has impaired waters. For lots of reasons. Sometimes it's just a matter of canopies in areas. So be very careful when you go down this slippery slope. Again, the whole idea of permit by rules is to get the department out of those small activities that could just be done, that are being overseen by local construction officials normally. I would just be very wary of where this may be headed and the burdens you may be imposing.
No, I appreciate that perspective, Ray, and you're right. We have addressed this. One thing I didn't point out was that we recognize that in the permits by rule that we have now, that they're not all created equal, right? There are some that are focused more on sort of maintenance and repair that don't really have any environmental impact whatsoever, and then there's some that facilitate new development. So, for example, I use this example all the time. My house and my entire property lies within a 300-foot riparian zone.
I've heard you tell me lots of times, yes.
Yes. So every time I mow my lawn, I'm using permit by rule 1. And I've tried to leverage that into not mowing my lawn, but my wife hasn't agreed to that yet. So anyway, that being said, right, I don't want to set up a system, and no one would want a system where if somebody has a car accident and breaks a telephone pole, and the utility company wants to put that telephone pole back where it was, right? Or milling and repaving by, where there's literally no expanse of pavement and no reconstruction, or mowing my lawn or fixing my roof. Those are the types of things that we would take off the table. And so the permits by registration would be focused on those activities that could potentially have an impact if done cumulatively. So, but your point's well taken.
Okay, Kevin has his hand up.
Hi, Kevin.
Kevin Bessica, Camden County Engineer. I'm looking at this more from the maintenance point of view that you just spoke of, Vince, and the guide rails that we're trying to put up for safety, or the mill and pave of the roads. Those don't affect really the permit by rule. But when we first got the minor bridge inspection reports, we filed a lot of permit by rule forms by fax. So I think having it digital is great, because then you know it really gets to somebody. So those minor bridge repairs, or those are good. What worries me a lot is that we have at those minor bridge locations, we have a lot of sediment that we have to remove, and I just hope that it's clear or somewhere that we can do that kind of maintenance work within, I think it's 100 feet of our right-of-way. Okay, but other than that, I don't have an objection to having to do it digitally.
Good. Thank you. I appreciate that perspective. And you're right. We're trying to reach that balance of not making a process that's burdensome or overly repetitive, but creating a means by which we can track it, right? Because it's hard for us to manage the environment if we don't know what's happening in it, right? So that's really our goal here. And then that way things can be inspected. There's an opportunity for which I'll cover in a later slide, but just even generally for any of the permits, even individual permits, like I said before, we spend a lot of time, appropriately so, looking at the permitted activities and understanding what the project entails and ensuring that it meets the rules and requiring a number of conditions, and then we sometimes don't even know if the project ever got built, or if it did get built, did it get built in accordance with the permit, or were there changes along the way. So I think that this online registration system can be leveraged to include things like, once you get a permit, before you start to work on the permit, you register and say, we're going to commence activities. And when the work is done, you go online again and say, activities have been completed. And then that way enforcement knows to take a look at it, and we can do a compliance inspection, or we can see trends in a watershed and so on. So, but thank you for those points, Kevin.
All right, thank you.
And Vince, from the chat, Elaine Dewan did note that there will be maintenance activities that will not need a registration. And Dan Kennedy followed up on Kevin's comments, saying to push that thinking to water infrastructure as well as other utilities, not just roads and bridges. And next up, we have Barney Hollinger.
Yes,
Barney.
Thank you. I have a couple questions on how this rule will affect the aquaculture industry, where we have some permit by rules now, and also some of the general permit and the IPs that I've had to put together for my nursery and for some other work out in the bay. Is this a time that we try to get those things changed so they more fall in line with other states?
Can you give me an example, Barney, of the type of thing that you're speaking to?
It's like I have a nursery tied to my dock, and because it's in the water, I had to do an individual permit, $3,000. Just like a boat, it's a big barge, and all we do is run water through it to keep the oysters, to grow the oysters up from seed up to about 3/8 to half an inch. Then we put them out in the bay. The other one, I had to do a general permit. I have a permit by rule that allows me to do cage culture out in the bay, but because I came up with a new type of cage, I was required to do a general permit, which was another $1,000. So how can we streamline these permits so that, I mean, if I put my nursery on land, it wouldn't have cost me nothing. Because I had this barge, I mean, it's a big one. I mean, it's 70 feet by 30 some feet. I had to do an individual permit, which I think is, a little far-fetched for what I'm doing.
Yeah, so these are good points that you're raising, and I think that since it's kind of targeted and focused on one issue, I would invite you, if you could, write us an email that kind of spells that out, and then we can interact that way. So we can get to kind of the main issues that you're raising.
Okay. All right.
But
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna go kind of quickly through the last few slides here, because I want to have a little time at least. It's already 12:30. I want to have a little time at least to circle back to some of the things that we covered in the last stakeholder meeting. So I'm going to just point out as we go what the slides are saying, and then at the end I'd like to kind of have a general conversation about these process improvements. So first, permits by certification. So as you know, these are online authorizations. A person goes online and certifies certain things, and then pays a fee in most cases, and then gets an authorization printed out that they can use. The thinking here is that the flood hazard permits by certification and some of the CZM, the coastal ones, that because they require engineering certifications in them, that we would require that a New Jersey licensed professional engineer be the applicant for these permits. The reason why is that in many cases, for example, a homeowner, let's say, is applying for one of these, and they'll have to certify that they have a certification from an engineer that does X, Y, and Z, or they have to certify that they're outside a floodway or something like that. And this is not something that, folks that are not used to our rules would really understand, and so it's almost unfair to ask them to certify those things. So, so that is the thought there. Any thoughts on that?
Vince, we have Ray Nichols, his hand up.
Hey, Ray. Ray, if you're speaking, I'm afraid I can't hear you.
I turned it off so I wouldn't make any noise before. Regarding the idea of avoiding unnecessary paperwork by people doing things, we've had some very dramatic environmental impairments, disasters as a result of some of the rules that have been previously created. And I think the state has a responsibility to protect the environment more than protecting the ability of investors and developers and speculators to maximize their profit. So there's a big thing about whether it's compelling public need or just desirability. Speaking to the current advocate for the business industry, who was previously responsible for a lot of those permit by rules when he was an attorney for the department. The horizontal drilling is a fantastic example. One of the things that, with respect to governmental agencies, when they want to use permit by registration, is that the responsible government official should submit a notarized statement to the effect that all conditions of the particular permit by registration will be adhered to. And if the project is large enough to require working drawings, that the conditions of the permit by registration be included on the title sheet of those drawings. On respecting the comment about compelling public need wherever it appears, it's important for the applicant to consider addressing the problem at locations other than the proposed location that would serve the same community. For example, an intersection improvement might be addressed by, instead of at one location where it's going to impact wetlands, by improving other intersection improvements nearby without affecting wetlands. That's just one example.
Ray, I just want to point out
it.
too. Oh, okay. I just was going to say, point out that you should always feel free to. You can email us if you have some more, detailed comments.
Some of my comments in the chat section.
Good. Yeah, we do read all the chats. So, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Last comment is on flooding, fluvial flooding. The 24-hour storm has been historically used as a source of data, but New Jersey, being adjacent to the Atlantic Ocean, has some unusual hydrologic conditions or climatic conditions, or where we get some intensive storms, precipitation events that take a lot less than 24 hours. I'm thinking the worst effects of Hurricane Sandy, and also the massive flooding in the Rancocas watershed many years ago, where there was something like 13 inches in several hours.
Mm-hmm.
With climatic changes coming, we're more likely to see these intensive storms in short periods of time, so that when trying to build in resiliency, it's important to consider short-term intensive precipitation events that may not be modeled by the 24-hour storms. But we may have historical data indicating that they do in fact occur, and that historical data should be analyzed for its effect.
Yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying, Ray.
Okay,
and again, I just want to make sure that you know that you can submit all these comments to us directly.
Sure.
You can email me, because I'd like to hear your thoughts. I also want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity else to weigh in, because you did bring up a lot of great points. So, any thoughts anybody has on what Ray has said so far?
Vince, we had Ben Stoneman asked me to read one of his comments in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
He asked, will permits by general, I guess he means, will general permits by rule and IPs be grandfathered when you go to registration and to certification, or will businesses have to go through it all again?
So again, I lost a little piece of that. I'm sorry, Lauren.
Yeah.
You said can you read that back to me? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I think his question reads, will general permits by rule and IPs be grandfathered when you go to registration and to certification, or will they have to go through the process again?
I see. So when we adopt regulations, we always look prospectively. That's a very good question. We look at prospectively and say, these are the standards that would apply to this authorization going forward. So it would not affect the previous permits that we've issued. They would be exempt from that requirement. All right. So the last few slides go through more specifically what we might want to do, the things that we're contemplating in the CZM rules and the flood hazard rules. Given that we only have 20 minutes left, I'm just gonna, I'm sure that you've all had an opportunity to look through these since you've had the slides since December. So I'm just gonna ask sort of generally if anybody has any questions about these last few slides, and then we can circle back and cover anything else that anybody would like to.
Gilbert?
Hey,
yes,
Tom.
thanks. Hi, again, Tom Gilbert, New Jersey Conservation Foundation. I forgot to identify what organization I'm with last time I spoke. We want to support the proposal to eliminate the permits by rule for horizontal directional drilling under flood hazard. And I think, the unfortunate spills that occurred during construction of the SRL pipeline are kind of all the evidence that you need to tighten the regs with respect to HDD. And then under the freshwater wetlands regs, so as I understand the proposal there would be to require general permits for HDD under freshwater wetlands regs, with some some exceptions that aren't defined. Obviously, I understand why you're not getting into that level of detail here, but that will be important. One idea that we'd like to put forward is that there may be a category where individual permits might be warranted under freshwater wetlands, where you would set some thresholds, such as if you're doing HDD through exceptional value wetlands or endangered species habitat or C1 streams, that a higher level of review and individual permit might be warranted for some categories such as those.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Thank you. Those are good comments, and we've had conversations similarly along these lines, and those are some of the issues that we're wrestling with right now. So thank you for those thoughts. Any additional thoughts from those on the call? How about even comments more generally to the concept of the interaction of, say, I would get a permit and the idea of registering the permit online or registering that activities are going to commence or that they've been completed so that we can inspect it. Any thoughts about that?
Ray Cantor.
Hey, Ray. Hey, Ray Cantor, NJPACT again. As I mentioned before, it's going to be difficult for the small guy to even register, much less having logging in several times. For most businesses, it's probably not a big deal. But if you're going to be inspecting these type of activities, they shouldn't be PBRs or permits by registration in any event. If you're going to send an inspector out, I'm assuming there's a real potential of damage being done, and it should at least be a GP, if not an IP. So, again, to talk to your compliance folks, going out and doing pre-inspections for all individual permits is probably a great idea, but you don't have the resources to do that either. If you're looking to do pre-inspections for PBRs, something's very wrong with that process.
Mm.
And again, you do have local inspectors, looking at things as well. Don't hesitate to leverage, the local inspector. We're probably issuing permits for all of this. It doesn't all have to be DEP, with your limited resources. Focus where the greatest benefit and greatest harm would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I can appreciate what you're saying. And that does kind of speak to, when you bring up the local governments. So each community, most communities in New Jersey participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And one of the requirements is that communities keep track of the activities that are occurring within their special flood hazard area in their town. And so what we've heard back from FEMA and also from some communities is that when people have built under these permits by rule, especially homeowners, they don't even know that they need to go to the town or so there's a bit of a disconnect because then the town can't report it. And so that's one of the other things that we're trying to do here is by registering, having folks register for these activities, that we could share that with the community. We could say, here's the activities that have been registered for in the last 30 days, or, posted somewhere easily accessible online so that a community can see the types of things that we've authorized. So, anything that, in my opinion, is that anything that we can do to kind of facilitate the communication between the levels of government and ensure that things aren't slipping between the cracks, is a good thing. But I appreciate what you're saying. We have to be mindful and thoughtful how we do this.
No, and just very quickly, I appreciate those comments, but, if I were doing anything on my property, the first thing I would think about is my local construction, inspector, not the town. So if they're thinking they need to go to DEP and not the town, I'm not sure, who's going to be thinking they need to register for DEP. So again, use your resources best. Communication and coordination, is best. Duplication and excessive, filings are in no one's benefit.
Thank you.
Jennifer Kofi.
Hey, Jen.
Hey, Vince. So it's probably not a huge surprise that I'm a big fan of the permit by registration, just to provide counterpoint here. I think this is an excellent opportunity to gather data. And so we know as you know, I work with the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. And by working with environmental commissions throughout the state and having previous experience working with a watershed organization, we know that the large majority of impairments that we're seeing to water quality and to our ecosystems are because they are experiencing these small impairments. So it's death by 1,000 cuts, if you will. It's not the one big giant project that always causes the damage. It's the small impacts. So the permit by registration is going to enable the department to collect some data about the impairments that are occurring in the environment, and then at some point be able to do, or watershed groups can do a rough level analysis of where those continuing impairments are either getting worse or stabilizing, and a correlation with projects that are happening. Right now, there's just zero intel or information about what the heck is going on out there, because you don't have to register or write it down or identify these projects anywhere. And to Ray's point with respect, I think certainly we know there's never enough money for the department. I would love to see you guys have a much larger budget and handle much larger staff than you have right now. But there's certainly enhanced coordination between municipalities and county governments that can happen. And we see that through the MS4 permit and stormwater. So construction officials can have an obligation. They can include on their checklist, have you gone to the DEP? Have you registered with the DEP? And it's a simple addition to the local construction checklist when someone applies to do a project. And NJAC is wonderfully situated to be able to get that kind of information out to environmental commissions and help the construction offices and zoning offices understand that through environmental commissions. So we're here to help as a partner as well.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate that perspective and those comments. Yeah, and it kind of does also illustrate too. I'm sure you're aware, in the wetlands, flood hazard, and coastal regulations, there's a provision. There's actually a whole subchapter where there's sections devoted to this that explains the process by which the department will promulgate permits, whether they're permits by rule or general permits, or permits by cert. And one of the requirements is that the activity, both by itself and cumulatively, would not adversely impact the environment, or in the case of flood hazard, cause public safety issues. So this is addressing that as well, because how do we know if there's cumulative impacts unless we can measure them, right?
Okay, Sandy Glick.
Vince, you had mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that we would have the opportunity to go through some of the comments that were unable to be discussed at the last session. I just wanted to just mention that because I know you're running out of time, and I was hoping to hear some of those.
Yeah, I agree with you. Let's transition into that at this point. So not a lot of time left, and I apologize, but again, these are important topics and did not want to rush through anything. So are there things that from our December 22nd meeting that folks felt was unsaid in the first few themes that we covered?
There was a lot of chat comments, and I think there was some discussion that we would discuss those.
Okay. Do you have one in mind?
Not particularly. I was just intrigued by the amount that there was and wanted to hear where the department came with that.
Ken Wilden has his hand up.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I think I'm representing the Delaware Bay Shore, Marsh River Township in particular. And I think we have to have a discussion on the differences between the Delaware Bay Shore and the Atlantic Coast as far as the economy and the environmental issues. I really don't think you could paint us with the same broad brush that you paint the Atlantic Coast. I think everybody's going to be in favor of protecting the environment, but not to the demise of human habitat and in our situation, entire communities. We are totally different than the big 3 or 4 or 5 along the coast. You got thousands of houses that you're dealing with there. You may have 25 or 30 in a community here. It might not sound like a lot, but it's a lot to us, and it affects our tax base. So I think there's things that need to be discussed there. And the bulkhead restrictions, in the Bay Shore, we have so many restrictions now to make them even more. It comes down to, it's really not regulation for us the way we see it, and my constituents see it. It's not regulation, but strangulation. It's total strangulation of the whole Bay Shore area. So I think we need to have those discussions.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ken. I think we actually do have a discussion set up.
We do. Yes, we do.
A week or so. I think maybe next Friday.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes.
Good. Well, I look forward to having that conversation then, because we want to achieve balance, and like you said, there's an economy of scale to in a community. So these are the things that we need to hear about. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Mary Pace Goldman.
Hey,
Hi,
Mary,
Vince.
how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
I just had a question for follow-up from our December meeting. Specifically, I was curious about the riparian zone modifications. I think there was a slide you shared with changes for threatened and endangered species, and I was wondering how that related to water-dependent species, or if there are other species planned for those adjustments.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So what the thinking there is that if you, one of our overarching goals here is to try where we can to have consistency between our rules, right? And one of the places where we in my opinion don't have consistency is in the fact that a wetland transition area can become 150 feet if there's any threatened endangered species, but a 150-foot riparian zone would apply only in cases where the species is quote unquote critically dependent on the watercourse for survival, right? So I think a cogent argument can be made that every species is critically dependent on the watercourse for survival, and I think that the presence of that habitat speaks to the quality of the area. And so the thinking was that we would align the flood hazard rules to match wetlands, so that if there's a 150-foot transition area, you'd have a 150-foot riparian zone.
Okay, thank you.
Vince, we have a question in the chat from Andrew Tabis from New Jersey Future, asking if an existing property is in an IRZ, what is the owner expected or recommended to do?
So that's a great question. So this speaks to, I think you're saying if let's say you own a home and it's already in an IRZ. So our regulations always look prospectively, as I mentioned, and set forth requirements for new activities, whether they're reconstruction or construction activities and whatnot. So the regulations would not affect the existing use of a property. So if someone was the owner of a home in an IRZ, the elevation standards and the other standards that we're contemplating would not affect them in any way. Where it would affect them is if someone had a home in an IRZ, let's say, and they wanted to make modifications to that home, they wanted to rebuild it, or there was a flood and the home was damaged or destroyed. The new construction that would be contemplated would have to meet the current standards of elevation and whatnot. But we're very careful to recognize that especially in cases where there's an existing use, that it would be a substantial hardship on someone to not permit restoration of a home, let's say. And in fact, our statutes don't allow us to do that. Our statutes make it clear that if a home exists or a building exists and it's been damaged or destroyed, that the owner has a right to put that back. So I think that addresses your question.
Okay, I just want to acknowledge that Joe Scopian has some comments in the chat, but I'm not sure that we have enough time left to concisely address those. So maybe that's something we could follow up on separately with Joe. Sandy Blick also has her hand up here.
So to follow up from some of the discussion from last week, from December. So my understanding is that the stormwater, the rainfall for stormwater will also be raised to address climate change. There will be a future cafe flood elevation with the increased rainfall, and then for reconstruction of anything that's a motor vehicle surface at a quarter acre, that would be at 80% TSS. I just want to express a concern with respect to the nexus of those three things, because the BMPs tend to be at the low point of the road, and the tailwater associated with the flooding will relate to the sizing of the BMP itself. So, you know, that's just something that we are struggling with as we're evaluating these impacts with respect to rising flood elevation, rising tailwater, rising inflow volume, plus the additional 80% TSS. Were there some thoughts about grandfathering certain projects if they've gone far enough along the process, or is that too early in this discussion?
Grandfathering, as far as like if it reaches a certain milestone, like we've been speaking of.
That's correct.
Yeah. So we certainly recognize that especially public safety projects like DOT has and other transportation agencies have can take years to develop, and that there's a recognition. I think a good example is what we did with our stormwater rules, right? Where we across the board, we said, here's the new standards, and you have a 1-year grace period before they apply. So we would be mindful of that, and we look to you to help us develop something that's appropriate so that we can find the right milestone and say, from this point on, we want compliance at this level, but we recognize that full compliance might not be possible if it's already reached a certain point. And I wasn't able to monitor the chat because I was focusing on the conversation, but I'm seeing now that Joe and others have had made comments. So I do wish that we had time to address them directly here, but I will read them all, and we can have subsequent dialogue.
And Vince, just a general question about when comments are due for this phase of the rule writing process.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
There was a question in the chat just generally about when we would like to receive comments by for this phase of the rulemaking process.
I would always say that the sooner the better, right? Because we do take the comments seriously, and we do want time to consider them and maybe follow up with some additional questions or comments back to the folks that are sharing comments with us. So if it would be of great benefit to us if by the end of next week you could have all your comments in. That's not to say that comments that are after next week will be discarded. It's just that we want to keep the momentum moving forward, and the sooner that we understand the concerns that you have, the better. All right. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Again, I'm very appreciative of the fact that so many people have chosen to spend another 2 hours with us to talk about these topics. They are important, obviously, and they affect all of us. And so I'm glad that we can have a robust conversation. I think that a lot of fantastic points were brought up today, and we do take that seriously. I hope that your takeaway is that we're listening, that we understand, that we want to do the right thing. We don't want to be burdensome, but we do want to be protective, and trying to find that balance is why we're here. So I want to thank you all. I hope you have a great weekend, a safe day, and I'm sure I'll be talking to you again soon. Thank you all.
Thank you, Vince.